was a Maxell tape ad where the guy's sitting in a seat that's a
Yeah.
famous seat, and he's like this, and the lamp is half blown back, and his hair's blowing, and
Yeah.
the speaker's there. But it's really a Maxell tape ad.
Yeah, it
But
is.
that's the speaker.
Yeah,
and
it
the,
is.
And the
Yeah.
fact is that that's sort of the lunacy of that speaker. You know, am I buying the speaker because it represents something to me because I lived in that era? Yes, no
Yeah.
doubt about it. I'm going to be the first to admit it. But at the end of the day, I don't think it's going to be the sound.
Yeah.
And nobody's got them to listen to.
Hi, I'm Lee Scoggins. I'm with the Absolute Sound. We're here at the Source AV stereo dealership run by Jason Lord in Torrance, California, to sit down and talk with Mark Spitz, the Olympic swimming great who won 7 gold medals in the 1972 Munich Games. And Mark, do you want to kick things off by telling the audience how we met and how this all came about?
First of all, I'm honored that we have a chance to sit down and talk, and we've done some talking quite a bit on the phone before this, beforehand, but this all came about because I had, quote, been an audiophile since, well, at least I thought I was, when I was about 14 years old, and I took a tremendous interest back in 1964 about putting together a stereo for what I could afford, you know, with my paper route, for an example. And wishful thinking, I progressed over the years, but I had been into it like full-fledged for a number of years, and then had, I think, the Ultimate system back in the year 2000, and then sort of stepped away from it for about 20 years, and then I realized that I needed to kind of up my game here with getting some new equipment. It was getting, as they say, long in the tooth. So in inquiring about interconnects and piecing together pieces of equipment, I came into contact with Joe Profito, and he's just a marvelous guy. He introduced me to the Claris line and convinced me that I should talk to somebody here on the West Coast that I can deal with directly and get this visceral feeling about, you know, putting my hands and touching it, kind of a touchy-feel thing. So that's how I got introduced through Joe with Jason Lord. And of course, now we're sitting here in this beautiful facility. And meanwhile, Joe was having a dialogue with you while all of this is going on to find out where you guys were at. And we found out that you guys were interested in putting together these types of video, I guess, casual conversations about expressing, you know, who you're interviewing and how they got to become an audiophile or their interest in this industry. And so here we are today, right now. So I'm pleased for my phone call to Joe and being introduced to Claris, which I'm a proud owner of their interconnects, of their Crimson line, which is incredible. And the whole loop, for an example, I've got the power cables, I've got the speaker cables, and of course the interconnects. And I, for the first time, went to balanced because my equipment was only single-ended at the time. And so I currently have Macintosh equipment, the MC 257, the 7-channel, and the MX 123A sound processor. I kind of wanted to keep those blue lights in the family. You know? But then I can explain the other equipment that I've had in the progression of having Macintosh stuff now. I had it once before, and I was very familiar with the Mark Levinson stuff, and you just name it. So that's why we're here now.
Yeah.
You know?
So tell us about your journey. How did you get into audio? And you mentioned, I think you started around 1964 initially. And
yeah. So I had a paper route as a 14-year-old, and I was starting my swimming career, and I saved up enough money that by the time I was 16 or 17, I went to a place in San Francisco because I lived up in Santa Clara, just south of San Francisco. I went to this high-end stereo place at the time, and I just fell in love with KLH speakers but my budget was basically a Scott receiver, and I ended up leaving with a Scott receiver. Can't remember the model number, it was too long ago, but KLH 17, Model 17 speakers, and I love those. As a matter of fact, I kept them in the family for years and passed them on to I have 2 younger sisters, and they each enjoyed them. But eventually graduated to KLH 5s. And the reason I was able to do that is that along the way, having participated in the Olympic Games. I have a degree in biochemistry. I was in dental school, and then here comes the Olympic Games, the second one I was in first one I was in was in Mexico City in 1968. I won 2 gold, a silver, and a bronze in my swimming events, and they thought I was a failure. I sort of was a failure because the events I didn't win the gold medal in, I actually held the world record in, and I got second place. As somebody said, I was first to finish second. That didn't sit well with me. So 4 years later, I go to Munich and I did what I did there. And then my pocketbook swelled to a certain degree. And the first thing I said to my coach was, I'm going to go out and get this esoteric equipment. At least that's what supposedly it was at the time in 1972. I ended up with SAE equipment, and I had their amplifier, I had their preamp, I had their tuner with a little oscilloscope thing. You know, that was wild. I even bought their speakers. As a matter of fact, they're little electrostatic speakers, and I thought that was really kind of a key thing. Of course, in the true tradition of being an audiophile, we're never sort of satisfied with the discussion,
right?
And we're constantly looking for that ultimate whatever it was. So I went through a period of about 5 years where I changed my equipment. I had Dahlquist speakers. I went to mono amps. That was the big thing, was actually these Kenwood mono amps. That was kind of interesting. At about the same time, I'm trying to package that with an Advent, you know, one of those projection big screen TVs, you know, that the room had to be pitch black. That was sort of the fashionable thing to do. And then I said, well, maybe I should settle down. And that was my first inkling with a Macintosh piece of equipment back in the mid-'80s. I was sort of where they were moving from tube to solid state, and I discovered that the actual lugs that be able to actually put speaker cable in the back of the actual Macintosh were sort of like mini lugs, and yet my speaker cables had the big lugs. So I had to send the speaker cables back to a straight wire where I had them, and then refashion smaller little lugs. So I was saying, well, if this is high-end audio and I'm just messing around, tweaking and middling all the time, I go, guess what? I enjoy it. This must be something that I should enjoy more, and I did, you know. So I think to be an audiophile, I found that for me, it was this art of being able to have brilliant conversation with people, experience going to stereo stores that had a lot of good displays and opportunities to A/B equipment, and then make the lunge and make a purchase. And through all of that, you know, I've had Mark Levinson equipment, got involved in the interconnect business with a company called Pure Logic, which was an interesting silver wire that was coated in Teflon. That was actually tunable because there was 3 wires and one was actually negatively poled, so that you could slide these 2 guitar picks that had 2 little screws that slide them back, and you could tune the actual interconnect. And it was amazing. Time consuming, but amazing. And I had those until almost probably, let's say, for 20 years, until I just experienced going to what I call you know, balanced interconnect lines. And so, you know, how does somebody get to where they ultimately can be happy? And I think that that's an expression that you and I have spent probably a couple of hours of time on the phone.
Yeah. Well, we talked about speaker placement for a while. I don't know if you experimented with that formula I shared with you.
Yeah,
the starting point.
Matter of fact, I forgot to tell you, I'm close to that formula.
Okay, good.
But I'm confined because I've told you that I had to have my, you know, left and right forwards have to be in a cabinet, because if I have freestanding speakers, I wouldn't be able to actually enter into the room, because
the way the room's laid out.
Right. A strategic place is right in the doorway.
Yeah.
You know, now that works fine once I get in there to do that, but that wasn't too practical for in a living environment. You know, that's a point that you and I have made before, because I think that the ultimate system for somebody is dependent on the tolerance of who you're living with and the environment of how you listen in the room. Does it become just a single...
Room dimensions, room acoustics have a huge factor, as I found out in my own experiments back at the townhouse in Georgia. Yeah, it's very important. You know,
I think that all of that... I knew all along, back the early 2000s, about 20 years ago, Since I live in my own home and I can control the environment of what electrical circuitry I have in the house, I put in a circuit panel that has direct line circuits directly to the room that I have with my high-end stuff. I have actual hospital plugs, not hospital grade. When you say something that you got hospital grade, it means maybe it's a look-alike. No, they're actually plugs that are used in hospitals, in the actual operating rooms where they actually won't spark. You can actually get a real big, true binding, you know, on when you're attaching the AC line. And so it's a special circuit so that nothing else is draining and adding influence and interference with a bunch of hash and noise in the line. And I realized back then, 20 some odd years ago, that this was important. And I was probably one of the first, at least in my neighborhood, and probably the first to basically take the leap in power cordage that made such a big difference. And my experiment with that was just monumentally phenomenal. And I realized, you know, it was like when I swam, I had a great coach, and I had a great team. And I knew that I was on a great team because they had Olympians, and this guy had coached Olympians. And one guy that went to the Olympic Games won 4 gold medals in the Tokyo Olympic Games in the sport of swimming. And I actually competed and swam right next to him and trained right next to him. And by example, I was kind of smaller. I was 4 years younger. I was 17. I was looking at his swimsuit. But eventually I was looking at him, and I broke his world records. And so, but if I took all of that ability and knowledge and then went to the actual swim pool and didn't put on the right swimsuit, I wasn't going to be able to compete. One, you had to have a swimsuit. They didn't have as wide a variety of options back in my day, but there were options, and I wanted to make sure that I had the right piece of equipment so that I could get the most. In other words, let me become the weakest link in this line of decision making. And I think when you put together a stereo system for whatever your budget is, you need to have one that doesn't have one general sitting on the side, which is an extremely expensive piece. And then component-wise, it won't complement the other items that you have. I mean, I really think that you learn, it's like my swimming ability. It's like, well, I might be the greatest starter, but if I can't swim in the middle of the race, how am I going to make a good finish? I've got to train for all of the aspects. And I think by having a sound system, I took that discipline and said, well, I may have to check part of my ego at the door, so that whatever my budget is, I've got to proportion the amount of money that I spend on each of these items to basically complement each other so that I can actually have great sound. If it took me 5 extra years to get the other component, assuming they still made it, to complement it, to have another general in the room, well, that wasn't really going to happen because I may not get to that point of being able to afford the other piece, so I might as well enjoy the best that I can make the system sound for what the budget is, than to have some super dynamic piece in there that just overwhelmingly not being supported with the necessary equipment to get the most out of it.
Yeah, it's almost like you have to lay a good foundation.
Yeah, we've
and
talked
that's
about
power,
that before.
that's cables, it's a number of things.
Yeah.
Now, no, I think that's absolutely wise.
I mean, I'm just realizing this, but we had a controversy in my sport about a swimsuit that was a full-length swimsuit, and there were different manufacturers that made a swimsuit that was of similar nature. And there was this big discussion about, well, is brand A better than brand B? Is brand C better suit? And I just said to all the naysayers, look, if you take all 3 swimsuits without actually having some swimmer actually put them on and you just put them in the water, which one's going to win? And they all came to the same conclusion. Well, but the swimsuit can't swim. The person has to actually don the actual garment and then swim. I said, they all do about the same. You know what I mean? I said, so you have to have the courage to make a decision of what brand you want, live with it, and then complement it with basically training hard. So if you want a specific brand and somebody that says, well, I like this brand of audio equipment because I think that they just make the best, great, then go ahead and purchase it. Complement it with the necessary items that are going to support that system. I personally think that I listen to a lot of people. I was in a certain business that actually exposed me to high-end audio and used to watch people go to listening, you know, at like a CES show or whatever. And a lot of these guys actually probably couldn't really afford the equipment, so the best opportunity for them to hear something that was absolutely phenomenally was in a hotel room. Well, that's not the greatest environment. These people are able to get a piece of equipment and componentize the stuff to sound fantastic, but they're fighting to be the first person to sit in the ideal situation, and there's always chit-chat in the room. So that, again, I didn't find that would be enjoyable for me to try to determine what kind of equipment that I want to get. Certainly living in a metropolitan area in Los Angeles, this offered me an opportunity with going to great places that had the stuff properly displayed. And with that being said, I realized to say, well, if I bought exactly all that equipment and stuck it in my house, is it going to sound the same? And I was rudely surprised that no, it's not going to, because that environment, I didn't have sound treatment on the walls, my room was different. I couldn't, in your formula, I couldn't get the speakers and sit in the proper position based on that formula, and nobody was telling me about this sort of stuff. You know, it's like, okay, great. Well, do I toe in the speakers? Well, that makes sense, because if they're facing me, that makes sense. But maybe it doesn't make sense. You know, maybe there's a different reflection on one side. So all of this is this: you can talk a storm of what to do, and most 99% of what people say they want to do is probably the right thing to do for them, but they don't have the courage to be able to actually launch on doing anything. So they're afraid. I mean, it's the same thing in athletics. You know, they trained right, they did everything right, they did the right time trials, and then all of a sudden they choke when it comes time to take a starter's pistol. They choke when they have to make up their mind because of the fear. Well, what if I actually do this and then I get it into my home and then all of a sudden it doesn't sound good? Or I didn't want to pay the guy an extra few dollars, or maybe I wasn't encouraged to actually say, can you help me set it up?
Right.
You're doing yourself a really a disservice as to your full potential of enjoyment. You know, so I just think that I've always believed, since I don't think you can ultimately put together the greatest sound system in the world, I think you can put together the greatest sound system of what, one, you can afford, one, you have to not make yourself be happy with, you have to go in and say, I am happy with my decision right from the get-go, and without reservation, without compromise. And when I say compromise to holding back to enjoy a piece of equipment. There's just too many people that get their equipment in there and they talk all the time about the equipment and all the time about everything. And in this whole time I've discussed with you what we're saying now, we haven't talked about, well, what kind of music do you like? And almost 99% of the people I've ever come
That was going to be my next question, because you and
Nobody-
I have had good conversations on music.
Yeah.
So let's move into that.
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing is nobody that I know has ever been to a concert listening to classic music. And when I've gone, I've bought 3 different types of actual seat positions, because from the same concert at the Disney place down in Los Angeles, you know, that Frank Gehry designed, it's absolutely phenomenal. And yet, if you sit in the middle towards the front, it sounds one way. If you sit in the back, all to the left, it sounds a different way. If you sit up in the balcony, it sounds a different way. And each one of those experiences are necessary, and each one has, I think, a certain level of enjoyment. And for the reason being is that maybe you went to the concert and you didn't order the tickets in time, so you're stuck in that position. Does that mean you shouldn't enjoy the concert? No, because the music is being played by the same instruments. And the sound theoretically should be the same, but you're capturing it based on the bounce of what's happening in the actual room. It's the same. It's the same when you put together a system in your home.
Yeah.
You know.
But there's something a little extra when you go see the concert live. I think the quality of the gear that we have now is ever getting closer to that actual live concert experience, but it's still not there. And so I always kind of.
Do you think it could ever be there?
Not totally, maybe. I don't know. We're making great strides in speakers and electronics. We're creating great line conditioners and grounding devices that ever more lower the noise floor, so things are sounding more present and real and open and clear. But I feel like it'll never be the same, and maybe that's a good thing, because we should support the performing arts. I don't want to just listen to CDs and LPs, but I feel like there is some truth to trying to go for that absolute sound, trying to get closer to that, get the timbre of the instruments correct, get the pace, rhythm, and timing correct, get the soundstage working in your listening room. And when all that happens, it can kind of be a time machine when you listen to music. But maybe to answer your question, I suspect no. I think there'll still be some magic from being there in person at Disney Hall and hearing Dudamel or someone conducting an orchestra. But tell me about your favorite artist. What are you listening to now?
Well,
what really gets you going?
I mean, I like Beethoven, and I have the Fifth Symphony, and I have it basically with different conductors that have recorded it, and also one that was recorded with the instruments back in its day, which is kind of difficult to actually recreate those instruments, which sounds totally different in and of itself. That's another thing too. I mean, you're actually at the mercy of who did the recording, what kind of pickup equipment, what kind of microphones are they listening to? You know, what was the source that they were basically laying down? Was it, obviously there's a tape machine that's basically got so many different tracks, and then how it's re-engineered, and then how digitally you can actually remaster tapes. All of this leads to, okay, great, just make a decision. It's going to get better as we go and know more about how to do that, and the equipment is better. So therefore, a recording today is, you would imagine, have to be way better than a recording that was done back in the 50s. But there are some, stampings of records that are just absolutely phenomenal, back in the 50s and the 60s. I mean,
and not just in classical and jazz.
Yeah.
Oh my God, there's so many amazing performances that we're getting these audiophile LP reissues that are just phenomenal from these 1958, era recordings and 60s, and the Blue Notes that Joe Harley and Kevin Gray and others are doing are just phenomenal.
We were talking the other day, and I was saying, I have this Pride recording, I have the actual record, but I mean, you can just stream it, of Harry Belafonte at Carnegie Hall. He did the recording over 2 separate days.
Yep.
And then they combined, and he did the same performance twice. So they're obviously decided to pick what they thought was the best performance. I'm sure he had a lot to say about that. And I can tell what day the recording was, and I'll tell you why. Because on one of the days that he did the concert, there were a lot of people that had colds. And there was a lot of sneezing and coughing and rattling and wrestling. Now I have a sound system that actually can depict all of that information. And there's one scenario that every time, everybody's got a special bunch of passages that they listen to the AB equipment when they get to the house. One of them is the Jamaican Farewell that he sings, all in the first 30 seconds.
Yep.
And he's on a stool, and he moves on that stool and actually goes, and actually you can see the floor, you can feel the floor creak.
Yeah.
Now, why is that important? The distinction and the clarity of that creaking, to me, is an identifying factor of how actually transparent my system actually is attempting to try to be.
Yeah.
And if it's more muffled, then I'm missing information.
Yeah.
I mean, my biggest discovery now, having had power cables, for an example, and I know I'm reverting back to a conversation about equipment, is that this new Clarius stuff with their power cables unmuffled my Macintosh equipment. It was though I had a blanket muffling my voice like this that I didn't realize I would be able to discover. So I sort of thought to myself, all this equipment by itself, in my example about 2 swimsuits can't swim, the equipment you can't hear unless you connect it.
Yeah.
You connect it to speakers, you connect it to the power, you connect it between the components.
It's like a system.
Yeah, and to me, I really now feel that may become almost 50% of the decision that has to be made. Not necessarily 50% of your budget, but that decision has the biggest impact of what you're going to get out of the hardware choices that you've made. And then you can get into a whole other discussion about what kind of sources you're listening to and what kind of streaming devices you have and how accurate that is and that sort of thing. But I like classic music the most. I can't understand the layering effect of how these guys just in their right mind. But remember, they didn't have the internet. They didn't have anything. They didn't have television. Their source of entertainment was these brilliant people like Mozart and Beethoven, all these people writing music for all the different instruments. A gentleman that literally lives about 5 houses from me is John Williams. You know, a modern day guy that's similar with all these movie tracks that he writes and all of this sort of stuff, and it's mind-boggling. And I just saw a program on how he wrote this music for the Jurassic Park, and how he was creating drama in the music. And I mean, I find that fascinating on music, about how you can invoke people's emotion visually with music.
Yeah.
And that's why that watching theater and surround sound in my home is so important to me right now.
So on the flight out here, I watched the Hitchcock classic movie, North by Northwest. That was a Bernard Herrmann soundtrack. And it was amazing, and it so much adds to the movie. And John Williams does the same thing. And it's super nerdy. It's sort of nerdy to be in classical music, but it's even maybe arguably more nerdy to be a film of classic soundtracks.
Yeah.
But they're just amazing. So one of my friends out here, Steve Hoffman, did some Eric Korngold soundtracks way back from like movies in the 30s and 40s that has great sound quality because the mastering was really good from Steve. And but you get into that when you have the system that can bring the resolution and bring those old analog tapes back to life, whether it's digital or LP that you're ultimately listening to. With the right mastering, you just get pulled in. That music is, particularly with soundtracks, is so immersive. But I'm watching the movie on the plane, and I'm thinking, this is amazing. Without this, there's some very dramatic scenes with Cary Grant and even Marie Saint in that film, and it's just amazing how much that soundtrack adds. So we've got to figure out a way to go talk to John Williams, Mark.
Well, it's funny because he has several homes, and he's getting up there in his age. And he, I guess it was last summer during COVID, I saw him. I was walking my dog, and he pulled out of his garage, and he took a long stare at me, and I was literally 15 feet from him, and I just couldn't open my mouth. And I've been with the Queen of England and prime ministers and 5 presidents, and I don't have a problem opening my mouth. But for some reason, I just well, maybe I would be irritating to him to come up and say something to him, because he's obviously got in his car to go someplace, and I'm going to prevent him from going someplace. Now, if he was out there just standing around looking at his garden, I don't think I would have had a problem. So I've actually seen his not caretaker, but a house, what do you call it? Somebody that takes care of his house all the time. And we were talking, and my wife knows this gal, and I said, "Wow, I'd sure like to meet him." And she came back and told my wife, "Yeah, next time he comes in town, he'll come over to your house because he knows where you live." Well, but that hasn't happened yet.
Yeah.
But I do,
Well, it's kind of got to be interesting to be in a neighborhood where you've got that level of talent just down the street.
Well, there's a bunch of movie stars that lived in our neighborhood too, which I won't mention. And Ronald Reagan lived just on the other side of Sunset Boulevard. And then after he became president, and then when he wasn't president anymore, they had a house in Bel Air. And he used to walk in our neighborhood all the time. He was the governor in California when I won all my medals in 1972, and I was there at the Capitol in Sacramento, California, and then we became really good friends, and then I was at both of his inaugurations, and I was up at his ranch up in Santa Barbara, and he was walking one day, and the Secret Service was there, and I went into this was before they had smartphones, and I was just in my garage, and the next thing I know, there's the former president of the United States in my garage kind of knocking on my window, and I got out and I said, "Well, Mr. President, I said, how are you doing today?" And he says, "I'm doing great." He says, "But I told you don't call me Mr. President, you call me Ronnie. I've told you that back in '72 when you won the Olympic Games." I said, "Okay, Mr. President, but not today." And I said, he's standing in a pair of sweatpants from Adidas with the 3 stripes on the side, looking real dapper, but he's got a pair of wingtip shoes on, like dress shoes, like he was forgot to take them off and put sneakers on. And I said, "So, Mr. President, why do you have these shoes on?" He goes, "Well, it's like this. When my feet hurt, I know it's time to get back in the car and have these guys take me back to Nancy for lunch." You know, he was just kind of a normal guy, just, you know, didn't think much of, any, you know, he didn't think, I mean, he was just a great guy. And I didn't ask him if he liked music. I never got into those discussions with him, but a lot of other discussions. But yeah, well, listen, back to music. I like all kinds of music.
Yep.
I appreciate all kinds of sounds. Having two sons, 40 and 30, I went through the rap era and this and that. And there's certain ones that I like listening to. Other people, it's a little bit. I don't understand a lot of it sometimes because they speak too fast. You know.
So let me ask you a question. Let's say that, you know, a younger son of a good friend of yours is thinking about getting into high-end audio, or they've been over to your house, they've heard the Macintosh gear, and they go, oh, this is kind of interesting. What advice might you give a young audiophile that's sort of starting out? You touched on a few things earlier, but I'm just...
I think initially somebody that is interested, I would ask that person, you know, do you have any particular type of audio equipment that seems to attract your interest? You know, are you interested in a receiver? That's certainly a very economic way to get into starting to, you know, build a system.
We have so many kids these days just love vinyl. The vinyl thing's just taken off, and they've gotten their first turntable.
Yeah, well, that's and the art of putting that together is just as complicated.
That's what we're here to help.
Yeah,
hopefully translate that into simplified terms.
Exactly. I would say that the best thing to do is go to some place where you can actually listen to equipment. Find a place that's got equipment that you think you are interested in. Be open-ended and open-minded. To listening to other brands of equipment. You may find that what you thought would sound good, you may be enlightened by something else that you get introduced to that sounds, maybe for the same budget, better to you.
Yep.
And always be willing to not close the door on getting exposed to anything. I've always believed, and I would recommend, go into a particular stereo place and go to where the best equipment is.
Yep.
And hopefully they'll let you listen to some of the finest equipment that they've assembled and put together. Get a feel for what that sounds like. Then compare that to what you can afford, and without compromise, understand the path and the journey that you will spend the rest of your life trying to get back to that room that gave you that experience. Because you need to know what that experience is. When I first started swimming, was never exposed to knowing what the Olympics was about. I was 10 years old. It wasn't on TV like it was back in 1960 when I was 10, like we see hours and hours of sports on TV. There was no cable television. There was
no ESPN.
No ESPN, any of this. Now, you know, I wasn't until I was about 14 years old where I understood about the Olympic Games, and that was sort of a vision. Couldn't quite understand how to create a pathway to get there, but my father and mom did, and understood that even in my own city in Santa Clara, California, that there was this great famous swim coach, and that swim coach had a bunch of Olympians that had gone to the Olympics and won gold medals from the program that existed right in that city. So I was lucky enough to be embraced by the younger kids program that would show me that I was playing along the freeway, so to speak, but I could see that freeway because those guys were getting in the pool, the champions that were Olympians when I got out. Eventually, I got old enough to make it into that pool at that same time, and misery loves company, and I just sort of experienced that way. So I think that in choosing a stereo piece of equipment or componentizing what you want is don't be afraid to go into a room that's got thousands of dollars of equipment that's displayed properly, because you should never deny yourself from the enjoyment of listening to that kind of pure sound. And then try to enjoy your selection, and you'll find that there'll be varying choices, I think, of equipment that you can put together. Like I did when my first piece of equipment was this Scott receiver, because I couldn't afford the Marantz, the one with the spindle wheel on there for the tuning of the.
But the Scotts were great back in their day. A friend of mine in Atlanta hooked up a Scott receiver once to some Magnapan speakers I had, and I was actually surprised how good it sounded. Yeah, it was ancient too.
So when I was in college, I got introduced to this one guy. I went to Indiana University, and there was this one guy actually in Bloomington that was an Altec Lansing dealer. But primarily they were known for their speakers. But they came out with a line of receivers, one called a 714 and a 7 something. I couldn't afford this. I could only afford the 714. And I had my KLH 17s with me in college. You know, I put them in my Mustang and drove them out there from California. And for some reason, the guy let me. He let me bring my speakers to him, and we played them, and it sounded great. So then I bought that receiver, and I had that for a while. And I passed that Model 17 and that Altec Lansing Model 714 down to my sister, and she loved it. And I don't know whether she's got it in the garage or whatever, because sometimes that equipment ends up, you know, collecting dust in somebody's back room somewhere. But I enjoyed that thoroughly at the time, you know. So I would just say, make a decision. Be able to reasonably afford. Don't go into debt. Not at a young age, anyway.
Right.
Eventually, you're going to think about that, you know. And it's always. I think owning a system is somewhat of a compromise. If you're single, you don't have to listen to anybody complaining about how loud you play it or where it's positioned in a room. So it's like dodgeball. You got to play that game and figure out what it is.
Yeah.
But be comfortable with your decision, and you know.
Yeah, I think that's sage advice. Well, Mark, thank you for spending time with us to talk about audio. I feel like we could talk for 4 hours. But really appreciate your time and all the phone conversations we've had. Maybe I think what we might do now is listen to some stereo equipment and maybe get Mark's reaction to that. Charles, did that look good, by the way?
That was wonderful.
You know, by the way, I want to just mention something about when people look at equipment. There's all these specs, and they spend so much time storing specs and harmonic distortion and intermodular distortion and all that sort of stuff, and how much watts they have and all that stuff. And at the end of the day, the equipment today, audibly, our ears are not capable of hearing those differences because there's hardly any distortion.
Yeah.
And back in my day, that wasn't the case. So these things were really important.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Really important, since we actually hooked up speakers with zipline, which was basically lamp cord. You know,
Yeah.
The biggest decision was, do I get 16 gauge or I get 18 gauge? Or do I get something that's 14 gauge and I can't bend the wire and it looks stupid? And don't get hung up in all of this minutia of keeping score.
Yeah.
I mean, even in sports, people do this all the time. Did I train hard enough? Did I do this hard enough? Did I do whatever it is? No, do me a favor. Just get up and perform. Just make a commitment.
Yeah.
Just do it. Don't be afraid.
I think enjoy it too. I think, our hobby has kind of a couple of different people. We have sort of music lovers. And I think if we're being totally honest with ourselves as audiophiles, there's kind of a group of people that are what I like to call, and I mean this affectionately, gearheads, where they may have a handful of audiophile recordings, but their equipment budget maybe is larger than their music collection. I tend to have a large music collection and try and buy the best gear I can for what I can afford at the time. But I think we should all enjoy it. I think you have to get off the merry-go-round and actually sit back and enjoy, listen to your classical music, and listen to your pop music, your classic rock, your jazz, your bluegrass, hip-hop, whatever it is, and enjoy it. I think sometimes we do get a little too hung up on the gear or trying to keep up with the Joneses and by the current DAC flavor of the month or the current record turntable of the month flavor. And I think it is, my view anyway, is that it should be more about recreating that illusion of a performance in your room and enjoying that. It's very healthy to enjoy that.
I'm laughing because you bring up something I think that's very, very important. Back in the day before streaming, where for $5 you can end up with 40 million whatever titles you want to listen to, just a push of taking your smartphone out and bringing it up on the screen and saying play. Okay, I think that my record collection at the time, and then eventually it became a CD collection, was proportionate to the budget that I sort of spent, so that my library was relatively the same size you would expect to the gear I had. Today, you can't be held guilty for being a gearhead because you can have the world of any music that was ever recorded for such a small amount of money per month. Then the question is, how much did you spend for the streamer? Then you become the gearhead to be able to place that piece of equipment in a position so that you can pick up that detail and then stream it to your system. The reality is, I really do pride myself at being a gearhead. There is something about wanting to wait to afford what I felt was something that I would thoroughly enjoy looking at, listening to, or just knowing that it was in the room. I finally came back to being a Macintosh owner, not because I wanted to throw my amp out of the window and say it survived because it'll still play.
They do look pretty tough, I have to say. I mean, Jason's got some pretty bulky amps. I think they did the sidewalk before they broke. In fact,
exactly.
They threw them out of the window.
Exactly. But there's something that any piece of equipment is going to be revered by the person that has decided that they want to purchase it for the reasons that I think I have taken value from. And that is that it wasn't the ego that I could show to some friend, look at what I spent. It was the fact that when I go in that room and it's not turned on, I know that I have it. I know that I enjoy it when I want to turn it on. And I know that what it represents to me as having arrived, and not arrived that my pocketbook could afford it, but arrived at that I actually put a system together to make it sound the best it can be. From not only the piece of equipment with the blue lights that I look at, but from the Clarius, for an example, interconnects and the way I've hooked it up, and realizing that I had a chance to A/B that versus what I had, and I go, I am giving myself the privilege of actually unraveling and opening up my piece of equipment, all of my equipment for that matter, to get the most out of that equipment. In other words, dialing up the watts, dialing up the power, and turning the power switch on. But even when it's off, I still get a tremendous enjoyment from that. And that to me is when you can get to that level of enjoying. Now I spend time listening to music, and I don't have to worry about that stuff that we just spent most of our time talking about the equipment. Because until to me, if all you do is enjoy the equipment, well, I'm not saying don't do that, but I just think that you will spend a lot of time, probably more frustrated than not, trying to enjoy being the gearhead guy, than to sit back and say, well, but aren't I judging that gear by listening to music? Where did that come into the equation? It has to be in the equation to enjoy it. And I think that from a person, for me personally, I listen to music all the time, and I think it makes me a more productive person in life with the way I can communicate with people, the way I feel about myself, the way I feel about myself with my relationships that I have with my business associates and my friends. And my friends, I think, have similar interests, So it's called contagious emotions. If you hang around somebody that you admire and that has a sound mind of how they go about making decisions, then I think you will make better decisions about not only what you want in stereo equipment, but you better decisions in what you do in life with just everything that's involved with just living from day to day. And so when I became satisfied That's why for 20 years I didn't do anything. I enjoyed my stereo the most because I realized I've come to a level where I don't need to be that person anymore trying to ultimately do it. I listened to more, my collection got larger, my enjoyment got larger. And the reason I came back was as my kids are graduated from college, I know that I want to experience what has transpired in this business over the last 20 years. And at even the lowest of level, entry level of whatever it might be, it's got to be way higher than what I was 20 years ago.
Yeah, that's the amazing thing about the hobby. The ultra expensive, like any luxury business, there's sort of been this emergence of what consultants call the ultra luxury segment. And unfortunately, I think a lot of people look at the high-end audio business and they see $300,000 and $700,000 loudspeakers and they go, well, that's the cost of a house. That's just crazy. There can't be that much technology. It's a box. But there is. But at the low end, a lot of that stuff that went into that $300,000 speaker has trickled down to the $2,000 a pair speaker and even down to the $500 a pair speaker. What Kef's doing with the coincident drivers at $1,500 for the LS50s, I think is fairly remarkable. So you don't have to spend a lot of money. And I think while we do have a lot of well-heeled customers that read our magazine, I don't want people to think that you have to be rich to be in this hobby. You just have to have an appreciation for good sound and enjoy music. And I think that the greatest thing that's happened in our hobby is how good affordable audio is. When I got into the hobby, I had a pair of Polk SDA speakers and Adcom Electronics. You may remember those, Mark, from the 80s. And I think all in, I spent $5,000 or $6,000 for that initial system. If you had $5,000 or $6,000 to put into a system in 2022, the sound quality compared to that system I had, and that, Polk and Adcom were great for their day. Polk's doing a lot of really interesting things right now, actually. But the sound quality you get today is 10, maybe 20, maybe 30 times more in a lot of different ways. So the technology progress keeps marching, but you don't have to be rich to get into it. I think I think more people, if they were to experience it, to go to a good store like Jason has here in Torrance, the Source AV, and other stores around the country that do this, to hear like you saying, and I think that's great advice. I was actually going to tell a story where my first big experience was to hear the big super system with IRS beta speakers that Mike Kay showed me at Lyric Hi-Fi, a classic store in New York City. That got me started on a journey, and the bug kind of infected me there. But if you can hear what's possible, and then maybe get to these better audiophile brands for more reasonable money, you'll have better resale value, you'll have higher sound quality, so you'll listen to music more. It'll just be more enjoyable. So I don't know why I'm standing on my soapbox all of a sudden, but I feel like I don't want people to think that, you're only going to really get great sound if you've spent $10,000, $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 on a pair of speakers. That's not true at all. You get great sound with $1,500.
Let me ask you this question. Since you obviously are exposed way more than anybody that I know, and a first-hand look.
Oh, I'm a fraction of what some of our reviewers get exposed to.
but the fact is, tell me the one or two pieces of equipment that you personally own that are your favorites, whether you currently still own them and that you are very proud to say you experienced that. What was a milestone for you? I think you told me, but I just want you to tell the audience.
Well, a milestone for me was I bought a pair of Wilson Alexia 2s.
I was hoping you were going to say that.
I'd always dreamed about owning a pair of Wilson speakers at some point, and an opportunity came up, and I jumped on it, and it was one of the best investments I've made. The second thing, to answer what the second, I'm going to give you three pieces, because 2 and 3 I can't decide between. The second thing was I recently got some new audio research tube electronics. In fact, we're sitting in front of some of this, some similar stuff to what I bought. But the thing that really did well was the Ref 160. It's a tube amplifier with KT 150s that drive the Wilsons. And then the third thing, and this is more of a tie for second, I bought a DCS Rossini DAC, which is recently upgraded to Apex. I'm actually doing a video series that we're shooting in my house, so that's coming to the YouTube channel for the Absolute Sound. Those three things, I go down to that room and I've got some pride in looking at that stuff, but it's really about the music. If I've had a tough day at work, or I'm just at home on a weekend and it's a lazy Sunday and I want to spin some vinyl or listen to disc, those three things take things to a different level for me. And I never thought I'd be at that level, to be honest, Mark, but I feel like, life's a journey and you just sort of incrementally build up on this stuff. I've been at this for 35 years and you just get a little bit better every year. You tweak things, you put in better cables, maybe you have a better power conditioner. In my house, I've experimented with better AC plugs. That's made a difference. I went to a high quality Ethernet cable. All of that stuff has a huge impact on the final sound quality. I've experimented with footers under the equipment. I've got a better equipment rack now. I've tweaked the position. But a lot of the stuff, like we were talking about Jim Smith's speaker formula earlier, a lot of that stuff, there's a lot of stuff you can do for free to get better sound. So my message would be, if you're thinking about, maybe if we're getting back to the question around what would you advise younger people or people just getting into the hobby at any age that just have, don't want to spend crazy kilobucks, I guess as some call it oligarch hi-fi. There are a lot of free things you can do. Get the speaker placement right, work on the room acoustics, and things just get so much better. So I think it's a really fascinating hobby. There's something new that comes out from a technology standpoint every year. And I kind of like it because I learn something every time. I sit down, I talk to you. Every time we have a phone call, and now we're in person, I learned something new about your experience and your journey. And I think part of the enjoyment of the hobby are crazy audiophiles like you and I and others getting together and trading stories about what did we do to the system and what did we notice, what was the effect on the sound from doing that, and what gear have we bought that works better and what gear didn't work out for us and why. Sometimes it's a flavor of ice cream thing. Some people are, I'm a mid-range hound. I very much believe mid-range is incredibly important. But I got a Wilson Audio Loki subwoofer, which I've got a review coming out on soon. And to improve the bass and to sort of put that bass foundation and that weight under the music has taken things to a different level. And
I'm glad you said that because I have my rail with my carbon fiber drivers.
The rails are fantastic. It's a fantastic product. And it really makes a difference. The thing that people don't understand about bass too is it's less about the bass and more about the space. When you have the subwoofer, the spatial cues get better.
Well, what it does.
Have you noticed that? That's amazing to me.
It takes my left and right speaker and allows them the freedom without the weight of carrying, because of the crossover, that information. And we've placed it in a speaker that's way more capable of understanding and carrying that load in a much more fashionable way, which is also amped specifically to its demand. And to me, that was important.
Yeah.
That's why tower speakers are great, because if you get the right one, all of that's sort of like a one-stop shop theoretically.
Yeah.
But there isn't anybody that I know that has a tower speaker that would not want to experiment with the right woofer. Now, there are very few woofers that will be able to support certain tower speakers because they need to be able to actually do it properly with the crossover. And that's a whole other discussion, because I didn't want to get involved, played a little bit dumb about the technical part of the stuff that I know, because I think that that gets into what I don't like, which is I don't want to keep score, especially for somebody else to listen to what my score might be.
Yeah.
But it's funny, I asked you the question about the speaker, about what equipment you like. I would say that the three things or two things that I'm very proud of owning, which was LS35As, because somebody turned me on to them at the time, my Rogers.
Well, the British speakers have amazing mid-range. I love the British speaker design.
To me, I just love the idea. I still own them. They're not in any system at the moment, but I would never let them go. And the fact is that I learned something when CDs were becoming really sort of into their own, and there was a lot of pushback from records, and the analog part of the records always sounded better, and they did, but CDs were trying to make a push in the right direction. So there was one engineer that I fell upon, and he gave me this like a Sharpie pen that happened to be made by a company called Stedman, which is a German felt tip pen. And it was a particular type of a green that had to be exactly the right green because they made 3 different ones. He says, I want you to paint the outside of the CD with this material. It's just an ink, it's not something you put on like that stuff that when you're typing, you remember, and you make they had some product that you painted the CD.
The liquid paper type stuff.
Yeah, they had something that was a green color that flaked off because the CD's spinning like mad inside. And he says, here's the reason you want to do it.
I think it was called One Stop or something.
Anyway, I said, here's the reason he says you want to do this. He says, most people don't most people don't understand this. When the laser hits the CD, it's hitting down on the CD. When it was actually a produced CD, it's a piece of mylar between actually 2 pieces of carbon, which is actually the plastic. Based on the type of plastic they have, there's a diffusion of the actual laser beam that goes down and hits that and sparkles all different directions. And it comes out the edges and also in the center. So what you want to do is you want to absorb that red light, and the best absorbing light is green. So if you paint that CD with this deal, you're going to hear a major difference. Everything's going to be way clearer. You're not going to have the sparking that's going with all this random laser light that's going back and forth and then bouncing back down on the CD, and then it's being misread and interfering with the actual CD trying to hit it.
And did you hear that when you did that treatment?
Absolutely. Everything sounded way better. And to me, that was a $2 felt tip pen that made the difference of actually having equipment sound way better. It's almost the experience of what I had with getting new interconnect, for an example, or finally going with balance, for an example. And there are ways in which you can tweak systems, but guess what? I get excited about talking about it because it was a simple, inexpensive solution. Hospital plugs,
I'll give you an example. There's this guy named Norman Varney, AV Room Service, I think is his company. He makes these things, they look like ice cream sandwiches. They're like footers, but they're little squares where it's like a compressible fiber with like steel plates above and beyond, and then like little rubber, sort of like waffle cone type layer on top to keep them from moving around. You put those under a 2 preamp phono or line stage, magic happens. Because Norm is an acoustical engineer, and he built those things to, we should do a video with Norm. I think we shot one at Expona recently, so that's on our Facebook page. But it basically creates really wonderful acoustic isolation. And these things are super affordable, and they're effective. And, there's stuff like that. There are any number of tweaks that you can do that make a real difference like that. Contact cleaners, there's all this sort of tweaks that really take the sound a little bit up, and they're cumulative. And by the time you get to the accumulation of everything, there's a major material significant, oh wow, I definitely hear the difference of that. But maybe there are 8 steps you went through to get there. And that's kind of a fun part of the hobby. There's always something you learn about. Hopefully, if our magazine and others does a good job, we can, whenever there's something new, we can bring that to the fore. Another thing is record cleaners. We've gone to ultrasonic record cleaners. You can hear the difference. I just bought a degritter from a good friend of mine, and you can hear the difference when a record goes through an ultrasonic clean process. It's remarkable. You're like, well, I don't know, can you really hear that? But I've got one of these Lyra cartridges that has great resolution. And you clean that record, the before and after it's been through the degritter, the sound quality takes another step forward. There are probably 36 products I could mention. I'm not trying to create a commercial here, but just to underscore your point, there are all these cool things going on in the hobby, and it's just like a giant onion. You're just peeling back one more layer at the time as you get deeper and deeper into it. So I think people that are like lifelong learners, or they're more analytical people, which I definitely fall into that category, it's pretty rewarding. And so I think as people get into the hobby and they start experimenting, it's a little bit like a science lab. There's always something new to try. And some things aren't going to work. And sometimes we're not going to know, even if they work or don't work, exactly why they did or not from a scientific basis. My view is to sort of have an open mind, and if something improves the sound and it sounds better to my ears, that's all that matters. I'm the guy that owns that center chair. I'm the guy that invested in that stereo. And
that'd be a good name of a company, Center Chair.
Yeah.
Think about it.
Yeah, so I want to share. You sort of indicated, like you said something earlier, something along the lines of, enthusiasm is contagious.
Yeah.
I think if people hang out with audiophiles that are experienced, they see that there's sort of this never-ending journey. But the sound keeps getting better if you do it right. If you follow a lot of the principles you spoke about earlier in the video, which is very, very wise advice, you'll keep getting better and better, and you'll wind up at a place that's just remarkable. And I think this gets back to your athletic training. It's a series of 1,000 steps or 1,000,000 steps. It's not just one thing.
Yeah, well, this is very interesting because when I've been asked, well, how did you do what you did? It's probably got the same answer as how did you put together a great sounding system? And the answer is this. It's the mystery and the magic of never having done it before. And that becomes the seeds of creativity. And you need to actually surround yourself with the experts. You need to have the courage to be able to experiment. And to trust developing your own opinion, one that you can stand on and explain and have the confidence. And I think that there's so many people that have always this trepidation of, well, I just wrote the check and I can afford it, and they put it in, and then you invite somebody over. Why are you inviting anybody over to listen to it? But that's just human nature.
Yeah.
What are they going to think about it? 99% of it, they're going to be jealous because maybe they don't want to spend that kind of money, or they don't have the same appreciation for doing what you did because they're more into something else.
Yeah.
I have this pet peeve when my friend had just put together a stereo system. They left and they bound all the lines together and with electrical ties, and they're all touching each other and this and that. I go, well, maybe I could understand that if you're running a speaker system through an office building and you've got, it doesn't really matter the audio quality, and you've got to tighten this up because they're going through conduits to 15 different rooms. I mean, but for gosh sake, it's only in just the room alone.
Yeah.
And so when I actually redid all my interconnect, I went and redid all of the holes that I have inside of the cabinetry, so where the looms of things that I have they may run parallel, but they're nowhere near each other. And then when they make, and then it's just timed perfectly, like I guess a roller coaster, that they make a dive down and go straight into the binding post, but they're not interfering or touching or anything near where my balance cables are that came out the bottom and went this way. So it took a long time to figure out how to do it so that the lines were, and I actually wrote it down and I drew it on a piece of paper. That made a big difference. I know it made a big difference because anything that's touching could add an interference. I don't care how well it's got coatings and dielectrics and however it's wrapped. Anything that can be free-forming and not touching something else has got to be better. So is that being an idiot? No, that is a true audiophile at that degree that I took it to what was important to me.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
you sort of said the same thing. So
Yeah.
there's got to be an aspect somewhere along the line recommending to this young kid that's getting in,
Yeah.
spend more time tweaking because your budget won't allow you to get maybe better equipment, but the tweaking itself will make whatever you got sound way better.
Yeah,
You know?
I can't remember exactly. I was having a conversation with someone recently, and one of the things that we decided on was, it says you could have all the best equipment. It's sort of like an audiophile question. You have case A and case B. Which would you choose? Case A is you can have all the best equipment in the world, but you have poor setup. Case B is you have very modest, affordable equipment, but you have it perfectly dialed in, perfectly set up, and maybe a higher quality room. Experienced audiophiles, inexperienced ones would go for the higher dollar equipment, the ultimate stuff, poorly set up. And I think, unfortunately, in our hobby, a lot of real-world systems do not get properly set up and implemented. And I think that's why having a good dealer, having manufacturers that are very, particularly with speakers, do a really good, have a standardized setup procedure, all that's important. But I would rather have affordable gear that's really set up where the person's really taking their time. You know, my friend Jim Smith that came up with the speaker formula that we shot a video of, and Charles here is going to edit soon. We spent probably the equivalent of 5 or 6 full days of labor tweaking my speakers and improving the room acoustics of my listening room at home. In the sound, the difference in sound from the cumulative effect of all that, and we did 7 or 8 other things besides just room acoustic tuning and speaker placement down to literally like a 32nd or 16th of an inch, is that it sounds night and day different. And it sounded good before, but now I'm happy for any experienced audiophile, even some of our crazy reviewers that have heard everything. If Jonathan Vallon or Robert Harley or Jacob Heilbrunn from the TAS wanted to come down and hear my system, I wouldn't be too nervous about that. But I think, like we said earlier, buy what you can afford. It's not a competition. It's just what makes you happy. But spend some time setting it up properly. You're going to get the maximum enjoyment out of that. That's a much better path than, oh, the current hot speaker is XYZ acoustics, and I'm going to go out and buy XYZ acoustics speaker. But if you haven't thought about particularly the speaker and amp pairing and getting that right, or you haven't thought about whether you have a good quality listening environment, or maybe you haven't put in some acoustic panels to improve that room, and get some panels up at the first reflection points, or moving the equipment out from between the speakers if you can, and that depends whether you have that ability or not. Moving them off to the side and putting some panels on the front wall, so to speak. Until you do stuff like that, you may not be hearing but like 50% of what your your speakers that you've invested in, or your system that you've invested in, is even capable of. So I think for me, all this stuff is important. When I worked in pro audio, Mark, there was a saying among the engineers that I think had done a lot of audiophile recordings. I think there was, it comes down to quality of microphones, where you place the mics, whether the mixing board is good, how much you use the mixing board, maybe in some cases. And all that stuff matters. And a lot of the engineers, there was sort of this feeling in certain areas of the pro audio community that every step when you're laying down a recording, every little piece in the signal path, as they call it, matters. Mm-hmm. Well, it's the same thing with playback. Every little thing, from the quality of electricity to the quality of the speaker, everything matters. And I think, but when you get it right, it can be, as we know, pretty magical.
Guess what? I'm happy I asked you that question, because
I'm going on too long. This is supposed to be an interview with you, not me being on a soapbox.
No, but the fact is that your audience, I'm sure, would love to hear your oratory on the fact that these things all are a part of what an audiophile is, or the quest to basically listen to the ultimate sound machine, and whatever it is. I pose just this last question. If you were taken into we're in a beautiful room now, but we were blindfolded, so we have no idea what the equipment is.
Yep.
And then we're taken into another room, set up exactly the same way with the same kind of like treatments and whatever, or with a different system that may have been, let's say, half the cost.
Yep.
So you have no visceral experience of what you're looking at. You only can hear the difference. What do you think the likelihood is the ability of somebody to be able to hear the difference between the two systems and pick the one that was the most expensive? Now let me qualify this. We're talking about a system that might be a $60,000 system and a system that's $30,000. So we're talking about super upper end systems. And I personally would think it would be more difficult to distinguish those two rooms. I think it would be easier to distinguish the two rooms if there was a $30,000 system and there was a $5,000 system. Because it's like diminishing returns, because you can keep spending way more money, but the increment amount, if you can't visually see it, you're not understanding what you're... I don't think your brain can... I think just listening only without being able to see the equipment and your environment is going to be a little bit inhibiting you to distinguish between the two systems.
Yeah, I think if you... Furthermore, if let's say you had 4 systems. One was 1,000, one was 5, one was 10, one was 30. As you go up in price, there might be smaller differences. But what I have found recently is that, particularly with speakers and maybe even some cables even, it's hard to say that the diminishing... I guess, let me back up. I've been thinking a lot about this law of diminishing returns. I think on one hand, it's true. But what I've learned as I've gotten into the more expensive stuff is that the gaps are still pretty significant. So while they may be smaller, they're still significant enough that if you have that $30,000 speaker and you go to the $60,000 speaker, there's enough of a gap there, you're still getting good value. Now, if you go to a $135,000 speaker, you're getting more value still. But I think there are diminishing returns. The problem is that you have to figure out where you are on that scale.
Yeah.
That's the important thing. Where are you? What can you afford? Not a lot of people can afford $135,000 speakers. But if you've got...
And part of that is speakers is in furniture making too. So I mean, there's a
yeah.
So
well, some of the cabinet technologies have gotten insane.
Yeah.
If you look at what, like, say, Magico and Wilson do on their cabinets, and what Sonus Faber does on some of their upper end models, the cabinet alone is impressive in terms of what they're actually doing and how they're manufacturing that. We've seen recently the M9 Magicos and this idea that Alon's doing with the honeycomb structure to make everything, even stiffer. There's just amazing technology, or the Wilson V material in the XVX Chronosonic and the Alex V. So I guess my answer to that is...
What is your answer?
This is sort of confused you at this point.
You mean you actually have an answer? Give it to
I
me.
might have an answer. So my thing is, yes, there probably are diminishing returns because that seems to be a law, but I think it's maybe not proper to just say someone that, I'll give you a very concrete example. If you have a $10,000 DAC, that's a lot of money. $10,000 after cash, at least in my view of the world, I'm just speaking from Lee Scoggins' personal view, that's a chunk of after-tax earnings. They're amazing $10,000 D-Day converters right now, really amazing ones. But I got to tell you, Mark, because I've been there, I've just done this recently. I bought a $30,000 or nearly $30,000 DAC. It's the craziest thing I've done. You know what? It may turn out to be my best investment. It is amazing. The Rossini Apex, which I'm reviewing on video right now, I'm almost done. The difference between that thing and the $10,000 DAC is vast. So I get a little nervous about diminishing returns because I don't want people to think, I don't want them to use that as an excuse if they've got the money and it makes financial sense to just sort of top out at that $10,000 DAC. That $30,000 DAC does bring something to the table. So I know these are crazy amounts of money, so I'm conscious of that, but I get a little nervous around that. I'm just going to be honest with you. But I think you're right. I think you're not going to have maybe 3x the performance as you go from 10K to 30K. But if you listen to a lot of digital like I do, and I use Qobuz and Tidal quite a bit in streaming, and I have a very large 6,000 CD collection, and a lot of it's SACDs and DVD audio disc, for me, that was a worthwhile investment. So I don't know if that answers the question, but that's my view.
But we'll talk about music. What do you think about somebody who sings, and then in the recording studio, they basically manipulate through synthesizing their voice and echoing and decay and this and that.
Oh, that's complicated.
They're actually making the singer sound phenomenal, but we're talking about digital actually implementation of that. So if that is actually what we're trying to spend all this money based on what you just said about trying to get the ultimate DAC to listen to whatever and how that person sounded, but they weren't really recorded that way. They were actually manipulated into sounding that way. So at what point do we stop that manipulation? Yeah, so
if it's more atmospheric, let's say, maybe as an excuse, I like Dead Can Dance a lot. I don't know if you've heard any of their albums. But sometimes I think Lisa's voice is made a little more ethereal sounding because it fits the music. I think if it's in service of the music, I think I'm okay with that.
That's a broad word, though.
Yeah, that's a little hard to define. That's highly subjective. Yeah. But I feel like what I like is sort of, I'm old school. I like the purist thing. You know, we recorded Rebecca Pigeon singing, this was an audiophile warhorse in the 90s. At Chesky Records, when I was there, they recorded Rebecca Pigeon singing Spanish Harlem. And it's a beautiful song, and her voice is beautiful. And that was a very purist microphone. Another example is Chad Kassem's Analog Productions came out with an LP of Dean Martin, Dream with Dean. And it really captures his voice really well. It's a 45 RPM LP. And it's one of my highly rotated heavy rotation demo disc at my house if you were to come over. Because the vocal reproduction is so amazing on a good system. I like that. I like natural sounding stuff. I'm a Frank Sinatra fan. I have a lot of Sinatra recordings. I like hearing Frank's voice. You could tell when it's well recorded, and I think, Sinatra used his own microphone. It's a famous microphone they have at Capitol Studios here in Hollywood, and I'd love to get a tour of that place, by the way. I need to talk to some people while I'm out here. But anyway, I think I'm more of a purist. I like just hearing a natural voice. For me, it just feels more real. It's more genuine. It's more authentic. So, but I can see examples, particularly in more electronic, more atmospheric music, where some manipulation might be okay. I'm from the old school sort of live to 2-track recording where you've got 2 microphones or ROTF. I do classical recordings in Atlanta, or used to pretty frequently, of the Atlanta Symphony folks moonlighting in string quartets. And when you get that purist microphone set up and you're just doing it live to 2-track, you're using good audiophile microphone cables, the sound quality can be really spectacular. And it's more about how to position the mics. That's the art of those recordings. I get a little nervous when you've got different musicians coming in and laying down tracks, and then the recording engineer is mixing all those tracks in on a giant mixing board. Yeah. The mixing boards have gotten to be more transparent, but you're still floating that signal path over more circuits than fewer circuits. And that does take a toll with sonic degradation. Although with some brands I hear very minimal But I feel like when you've got all the performers in the room, much like Rudy Van Gelder did when he had 4 or 5 jazz musicians in his parents' living room, and then later in Van Gelder's studios, there's something about the interplay between people, particularly in jazz, but also in classical and pop, when everybody's kind of grooving in, and they're kind of locked in. That's when the magic happens. That's when you, as a listener, you can kind of hear the band playing real tightly. I like that. I don't like the heavily processed stuff.
I love it when I'm listening to somebody play the guitar, and as the session gets longer, you can hear their fatigue, where they're actually sliding their hands, and you can hear their zzz, you know what I mean? Zzz, they're moving their hands on the frets, and or they're taking a. You can hear that. I find it fascinating to get a recording to basically not have that drowned it out. And to me, I just find it fascinating. It's almost like really being there, because that is a human being. They have to take a breath.
Yeah.
They're moving an instrument. They're playing that instrument, and that's a part of really life. To me, that's my enjoyment out of listening to somebody might think that that's not a great recording, but to me, I think that's a great recording, because that's, to me, would be like a live performance. It comes, I hear it, and you can't deny it.
Yeah.
And it's gone. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I find that, to me, I finally have a system that I can hear that sort of stuff. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think when you hear that resolution,
there's so many adjectives that you can use.
You could say resolution, you could say detail, but it's got to be musical. I think the very best systems is when you have the detail that the audiophiles crave on the one hand, but it's also very musical. It sounds like live music. It sounds like real music. When you play a guitar or a Stradivarius violin, it sounds like, the violin is a rosiny instrument. I've recorded a lot of violins in my day. There's a certain sound to it. When that is right, it's very musical, and it's got a very sweet tone. I personally think ideally you want high-res digital for something like that, over 1644. But when all that comes together, there's just magic. You forget about the gear. You forget about what speakers you have, what cables you got, what electronics you have. All that audiophile stuff just kind of fades away, and you're just marveling at the musical performance. I think that's when you cease, even if you are a gearhead, when you cease being a gearhead because the music is so involving and it's so immersive, that's when you know you've got something. And it sounds like that's what you have at home.
Yeah, I mean, there's a time to train, and there's a time to perform.
Yeah.
So the time to train is the process of getting your gear put together, sorted out, pieced together, tweaking it, this and that. But in the true essence of why did you do that, then the time to perform is to listen to the performance and to sit back and say, boy, I really enjoyed listening to music for the last hour and a half. It took me someplace.
Yeah.
And we need to be taken someplace.
Yeah.
Because our life is so cluttered with just 4-minute sound bites that are just constantly just being thrown at us. So a presence of being relaxed, it's therapeutic.
It is.
And to me, that is the bottom line,
Yeah, there's a health aspect to this. Our owner, Tom Martin, and I talk a lot about there's sort of a health aspect to just, it relieves stress. It provably relieves stress. There is so much information coming at us. We're never disconnected. We have our phone, our supercomputer phones now in our pockets, and it's just good to put down the phone, not do anything, not take calls, not look at the text messages, just make it all fade away. I have another hobby, and there's an analogy, and I can't, I'm too much of a car guy not to bring this up, but we have this driving club, and it's where a bunch of us kind of go and we race our cars around the circuit at Road Atlanta, which is an extremely difficult course with a lot of S-curves, a very a famous turn 10A where it's almost like a 90-degree angle and another 90-degree angle to the right. And it's so intense to be on that course driving, you literally can't think about anything else because you're so focused on getting around that circuit safely and at as high a speed as possible, so your lap time is as low as it can be, just for personal, whether you measure yourself up personally or you have other friends in the club and you want to at least be, in their general area for lap times. It's just, like there's an athletic estimate. It's physically demanding too, but it's very mentally demanding. But the good thing about it is when I go out to that track, I'm not thinking about anything else as I'm going around that crazy circuit in Brazelton, Georgia. Audio's the same thing. When I get in that comfortable center chair I have in my listening room and I got everything working, I've gotten off the merry-go-round, I'm not thinking about, I need to get a better CD player, I need a better turntable, I got to upgrade the cartridge. I'm not sure if those are exactly the right cables, and boy, it would be cool if I had those better electrical outlets. I'm not thinking about any of that. I'm just thinking that's an amazing performance, whether I'm listening to Van Morrison, Frank Sinatra, or Hank Mobley, or Gustave Dudamel. I am just kind of focused on that music, and I'm not thinking about anything else. And that's got to be psychologically a good thing for humans, particularly in this era of information overload that we have.
Well, I mean, I'm just happy that my system is such that my wife and I, because of COVID, listen to a lot of music, but we also watch a lot of movies. For an example, like Netflix will be, you can power watch something, so you can watch, 8 episodes of something, nonstop.
I think I did that with Ozark.
But so the whole point is this: is that if your system is phenomenal, you're listening there and you're just involved in this experience. Like, I wouldn't think of sitting in a movie theater and watching 8 hours of something. Of course, it's not offered to me to even do that because there's no 8-hour movie that I'm aware of. But the fact is, you can watch 8 or 10 hours of something and not really get tired.
Yeah.
It's not fatiguing if the sound is perfect. A lot of things, of course, we get into the discussion about whether it was recorded properly, but a lot of these types of productions that spend a lot of time on the way they package their music and the sound effects, and it's so enjoyable. We've had friends that have come over and go, I never realized how much I like watching TV, and I only like it watching it in your home. And I go, well, why do you think that is? I said, we have the same size TV. 75-inch Sony TV.
Yeah.
Why do you think you'll enjoy it? He says, you have a bigger center channel speaker than I do. You have better system than I do. You have set it up properly. And the sound is so phenomenal that I spend more time watching the movie or watching the series than what is fatiguing to me to watch in my home. And part of it is the distortion and everything else that they're experiencing.
Yeah, for sure.
And so, again, is being an audiophile has a lot of more aspect than just being a gearhead or a tweak nut.
Yeah,
You know what I mean?
yeah, exactly.
It has to do with, ultimately, hopefully, you can sit back and enjoy what you've created. I mean, I created what I spent to try to get to where what I think I have is enjoyable to me. And I can say it honestly is enjoyable to me. I think there's just too many people that can't, I don't think they experience what or you. I don't know if a lot of people can get there. I don't know why. Doesn't matter what your pocketbook is.
Yeah.
Like Elon Musk, I don't think could ever get there. No matter how much. In other words, if he wanted to be an audiophile, I mean, into the extent that he wants to spend money on something, and money is obviously not an object to him that's going to hold him back, do you think he could be happy with, quote, an ultimate system? Maybe not.
Maybe not. And especially if he didn't invest the money in a proper setup, or he didn't find a dealer that would properly set everything up and dial it in, he won't hear even if he bought the very best speakers and electronics, he wouldn't hear what those are capable of.
So I'll keep this a secret, but just ask Jason about the Elon Musk story.
Okay, I will. And I think
and that's quite
we
amazing.
probably should interview Jason, actually.
I thought you were.
Yeah, no, I think he's up next.
Yeah.
Have we got enough footage, you think?
We're an hour and a half in.
Oh my God, we're just rolling. This is like one of our phone calls. We can't shut up. We got 2 talkers on the phone.
Yeah. Well,
I think we covered some really good ground here, though.
Yeah, I think there's this information that you could package together. You could make, 5 10-minute shows if you needed to. You know, or whatever.
Well, that would be
because I don't know if you could hold an audience long enough, but I think there's some very interesting situations here because to be honest with you, if we're not talking to the audience that understands what we said, then they're not listening to us more than 5 minutes anyway. If they're listening to us, then aren't we actually jumping across like a frog across the lily pads, to stay afloat, saying, oh, that sounds like me. Oh my God, I experienced it. Oh my God, he's talking to me. Oh, he had that too? Oh, he suffered like I did?
Yeah.
Oh my God, he made a mistake like I did?
Yeah.
Right?
Oh man, I made a lot of mistakes. We probably should have videoed all the mistakes I did building my system. I'm at a pretty high place now, but man, they were many mistakes.
My reach speaker was Wilson Watt puppies, but it just wasn't going to happen. In part because of my restriction of it had to be in a room.
In the cabinet, yeah.
It had to be in a cabinet. Well, somebody says, well, why don't you put it in another room? Well, the problem is I'm married, and that person also lives in that house and in that room. And my living room is like from all the things I've collected around the world, it's sort of like a gift shop, God forbid I move something different in the cabinet over there or whatever. To be honest with you, because I know I at one time had speakers in the living room, which was the other set of LS35As, and I know that although it was zip cord back then, back in the 70s, I know that it would be acceptable to my wife to put another set of speakers in there, and I've been thinking about going vintage retro and getting the speakers that I never had, which was the L100, but the special 75-year version, because they have a different crossover.
Yeah.
And all I think of is that I think I would be making a mistake because it's.
I like the ones with the orange foam that look like little cubes.
Yeah.
Well, like a zillion cubes.
Yeah. Well, they make.
This is before your time, Charles, but it's like really.
And then you can get them in
really 70s.
Ugly blue or the orange.
Yeah.
Which is cool. Or
I like the
brown.
orange though. Orange for me is.
But they have a 75-year anniversary version where they only made 200 of them. It gets shipped in a big container.
Oh, I haven't seen those.
Well, because when you take the actual frame where that foam is off, it's usually black. Theirs is all wood laminated to match the sides, and it's special, but the crossover is different, and it actually supposedly is a better speaker. I was thinking of getting it because it would just be unique. And there are around still available.
Those speakers are a little warm sounding though, just like we talked about on the phone. They're a little warm sounding.
I don't think they're going to be they're not going to be as clear to me and precise and detailed in a musical sense. They're going to be more oriented towards the way the speaker was originally designed. And back in the 70s, the greatest reason that speaker was great was a Maxell tape ad where the guy's sitting in a seat that's a famous seat, and he's like this, and the lamp is half blowing back, and his hair's blowing, and the speaker's there. But it's really a Maxell tape ad.
Yeah, it is.
But that's the speaker.
Yeah, it is.
And the fact is that that's sort of the lunacy of that speaker. Am I buying the speaker because it represents something to me because I lived in that era? Yes, no doubt about it. I'm going to be the first to admit it. But at the end of the day, I don't think it's going to be the sound. Yeah. And nobody's got them to listen to, at least hooked up to a system like I want.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring those speakers because I have a friend that's in your age group, and he bought them because it was a speaker that he had when he listened to classic rock back in the day. And he just wanted to have a pair for one of his upstairs offices, just so he could listen to that and get that.
Is he disappointed?
Relive that 70s, classic rock sound. I don't think he bought the 75th anniversary one, although he might have. I'll have to ask him. But that was a really.
Is he happy with them?
He's happy with them. He's like, look, I'm an audiophile. These are not the clearest and most neutral speakers, but I didn't buy them for that. I bought them because I wanted to hear classic rock over classic 70s speakers, and he liked it.
The only reason I want to actually set that room up with 2 speakers is because the room is quite large, and I have a couch, just like we're sitting in now, that would provide me 2-channel listening, and I can design the system to where it's feeding off my Macintosh stuff, where it's a dedicated 2-speaker listening room. But if I do that, then those speakers, which aren't as expensive as probably what I would probably really ultimately like to have, is a much more expensive tower speaker there that would be more, quote, audiophile listening. My problem at my age is that when you start listening critically in an audiophile sense, it can be exhausting. Because am I listening because I'm trying to get new equipment, or am I listening to nuances? Most of the enjoyment that I get from music today is almost like music, like an elevator. In other words, I do my thinking, I do my reading, and I do a lot of things surrounded by that noise. And I wanted to, and I know that the noise sounds great. But to specifically go and sit down and say, no, I'm just going to sit here. I'm going to be fidgety with what am I going to listen to, what am I going to listen to, what am I going to listen to. And then I want to play it at a level that nobody in the house other than my listening level will enjoy.
Yeah.
And therefore, I've sort of terminated that thought for a while.
Yep. Understand.
Anyway.
Well, that was great.